first job as a nurse was in the mid-'80s on an HIV/AIDS floor. We were a research site, our floor in San Francisco General. So all my patients suffered horrible deaths, and I saw a lot of agony and what I call a bad death. And so that was very informative for me as a young nurse. And from that, I never left end-of-life care. It really wasn't my choice to be on that unit initially, but it became my passion. And it was a place where I think it also connected to my childhood. My parents were both in their mid-40s when I was born. So many of my constant activities were going to visit elder relatives, going to nursing homes, going to grave sites and putting wreaths on the grave site. So I think death was part of my childhood even. And I was constantly told by my mom, like Susan's mom, like Susan's dad, if I ever get like this, try to end my life. And, you know, there's a death movement now, which is kind of exciting because people in my mom's generation didn't have many opportunities for knowing about and, you know, stopping eating and drinking or medical aid and dying. That those laws didn't exist. So now there's a movement. I think the boomers, you know, my generation onward are really saying, we don't want to die like our parents and our grandparents died. We don't want to suffer. And we have to become somewhat of activists around it because we've got this force of medical technology, the medical industrial complex, I like to call it, which is telling us that we can keep you alive. You know, we have media telling us that we can live forever, right? Like Botox and all the ways that we can keep ourselves looking young, and we're kind of immortal. We're told to think that. So we have to resist that and realize that our mortality is real. And, you know, I have this quote that I like to say, you know, tell me how you want to live by telling me how you want to die. You know, I want to live, so show me how to die. You know, that's something that I really feel like we need to talk about in our core. When I was at community hospice several years ago, I started doing death cafes. And one of the biggest cafes I had was 91 people came together at the Potter's House, which is a small coffee house in Adams Morgan. And I realized at that coffee house, at that death cafe, that there were so many interested people at all levels. I think our youngest person in the room was 15, and the oldest person was in her late 90s. And it was just a rich conversation of all kinds of ideas and people coming together in a safe place to talk about their fears, they're wanting to gain knowledge and really want to be empowered because people are feeling very disempowered about their end of their life. So I put together a little slide presentation, and I think, thank you all for letting me come and share with you, by the way, that the Capitol Hill Village is awesome. And I know some of you participated in our event. We had, and Iona had a end of life expo at the November of 19, and we had over 200 people attend, and we had about 100 people on the wait list. So that was very exciting. And I think some of you all came to that, which is kind of the impetus for having this conversation, and I hope we can continue to have more. But if you could just throw on the slides, we'll go through those kind of quickly, and then we'll have time to have conversation. So this is a beautiful sunset. We have a place on the Chesapeake Bay, and so I enjoy the sunset frequently. And I think talking about end of life is talking about the beauties and wonders of sunsets and how people die not only impacts them, but it impacts the people who are living and who are grieving. And so we just really, really, really need to keep the conversation alive because death stays with us for a long time. So we're going to talk about some values and choices. And so taking stock, these are just some things we're going to go over today. Understanding the future, our personal futures with our own health, getting specifics from our clinicians, identifying what matters most, considering life prolongation, and communicating and documenting our wishes. So first you have to examine how you view yourself. I mean, you can be, I have a friend who came over for dinner last week and she's 98 and she sees herself as a kind of as a healthy older person. And I think of her as a healthy older person. There's young and healthy, there's older and healthy. People who struggle with chronic illnesses like diabetes, congestive heart failure, COPD, who are, people who have lived with asthma for a long time. So just knowing what your chronic illnesses are. And then there's folks who have serious illnesses that we've all encountered, and maybe we struggle with that ourselves. And then there's the place of seeing yourself as nearing death. And then I just added, there are definitely people in our lives who say they may not be any above, but they just wish that they were not alive. And I always like to explore how, when people say things like that, I like to explore where that comes from, whether it's external or whether it's an internal issue. And if they have thoughts about taking their life. And we know that suicide is epidemic right now, and we need to really help people, accompany people through that, and make sure that they're safe. So aging is not for sissies. I'm sure you've heard that. And the older I get, the more I realize that. So just looking at trajectories of death, we have sudden deaths that happen. And I had an older cousin who just the snow shoveling a couple of weeks ago, a month ago, we had that snow, he went out to shovel and he died. And it was pretty shocking to the family, really healthy guy, but it happens in all of our families. Terminal illness, like understanding the trajectory of your particular terminal illness, whether it's Parkinson's or, or a cancer that's considered terminal, just knowing what's down the line is so important. Organ failure, thinking about somebody has a chronic diabetic condition that with some possible kidney failure, like what does that look like down the road? And then also just long frailty, like, I had patients in hospice who were over 100 years old, but they didn't really have any particular terminal illness. But it was their organ failure that I wanted to kind of zone in on to see if they could qualify for hospice. So we'll talk about hospice a little later, but you can be very frail and failure to thrive and still not qualify for hospice. So this trajectory, just to jump back, if you read Atul Gawande's book, he has images of function over time, and it shows different diagrams of what those each look like. So getting facts from clinicians, I really can't underscore how important it is to have a physician who has your values. I have a current client who very much wants to plan for medical aid in dying. But when I met her, I informed her that her primary physician is a Roman Catholic and he will never accompany her or help her with that process. So, so that's something that I said, you have time to teach him about your values around that, but he's going to abandon you when you get to that place, if that's really where you want to go. So just to always talk about what your values are and then see how they align with your physician. So to understand the patterns of your trajectory, like talking to your doctor about, I have these conditions, what can I expect down the road? What treatments might offer optimal health? What treatment potentials are for benefits and for burdens? And every treatment modality has both. And when they start out weighing each other, when the burden becomes greater than the benefit, that's when you really need to have a heart-to-heart and say, this does not make life worth living. And it really has to come from the patient. I used to believe that, in nursing, we always talked about patient-centered care. And now I feel like it has to be patient-directed care, because you are the one that's suffering. You're the one that's feeling the nausea or feeling the sleeplessness at night, or the having to sit in the ER for hour on hour waiting for some attention. So it has to be directed by you. And there, I think many years ago, folks and, you know, the older generation feels like, doc, whatever the doctor says is the decision that I'll make, because it's a kind of paternalistic relationship. And then we moved into like a partnership where we were on equal planes with the doctor. But I think now we really need to be like, the doctor can give clinical advice, and then you also need to do your own information seeking to figure out what's best for you. And we need to help teach our doctors that we are mortal beings, because they're not trained. They're trained to treat disease and not trained to help us die. And hopefully that is changing. If living longer is important to you, how much more life would you expect? Is a question I like to ask the doctors. What potential symptoms will I encounter and burdens of treatment? But the goal is that you want truth, and always, always, always bring a friend to witness and to keep notes and to help retain the information that you're learning. Avoid loneliness, because we need to be in a partnership as we age. Okay, so here are things that I can directly ask the doctor. Please tell me like it is. I need to know so that I can plan. If you're looking at something that is a chronic progressive debility, you know, what will my disease look like in a month, in 6 months, in a year, so I can plan both financially. I can look at housing issues. I can look at caregiver issues. I can maybe relocate closer to people who I know. So you want to really know. I like to say to doctors, you see a lot of people with this disease. What is the pathway of my disease likely to take? Would you be surprised if I were alive in 5 years or 1 year or 6 months? And I love to throw this question to doctors when they are clearly not talking about the elephant in the room with hospice. I typically, because hospice prognosis is usually a 6-month prognosis for eligibility, I also like to add, what about a year? Would you potentially possibly not be surprised if this person is gone in a year? And that kind of opens us up to invite more conversation. So what will the benchmarks be when I will qualify for hospice? And, you know, like talking about dementia with Susan. I mean, I love hearing Susan sharing, because I've read her book. I highly recommend her book. I've shared it with a lot of friends, and actually one of my patients gave it to me, and that's how I met Susan. My patient introduced me to Susan, and she spoke at the End of Life Expo 2 years ago, which was great. But one of the things about dementia is there are benchmarks that qualify you for hospice. So you have to be aware of those, like when people are not walking and eating and drinking and not swallowing well. That's when we need to say to our doctors, can you please give us a hospice referral? Because they're in the very late stages of dementia. Okay, so then another question for physicians is, what are the benefits and burdens of treatment that you're suggesting? What are possible alternatives? And what happens if we don't pursue them? And then a final question is, and this is one I just asked the doctor the other day, who has a very, very dear friend of mine who's on metastatic cancer, probably 4 different organs. And I thought for sure the doctor would tell her that she's out of treatment options and she was going to refer her to hospice. But she didn't. She told her she had another treatment option. And so I had to ask her, would you recommend that to your sister? Because I just found it like cruel. And so it's many layers of complexity. There's part of the patient who really wanted to be offered another treatment because she's terrified of dying. And I get that. And so I'm taking her to her IV chemo treatments next week because I want to accompany her to the end, and she's not willing to stop. But I wanted the doctor to know that I don't think that she would have offered that to her sister. So anyway, that's what we need to do. We need to get really personal with our clinicians because they're humans and they have families, And studies have shown that most doctors choose to die at home with hospice and to stop treatment at a certain point. Next slide. Oh, wait, do we go back with one? Go back just one. Is that the next one? I'm sorry. Did we skip a slide? Hello.
Yeah. What matters most to you?
Is that the, yeah, whatever the next
That's
slide.
the one. I think that's
My
the next one.
apologies. I advanced it and you didn't see it, and I'm trying to get back to that.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so just examining your own feelings about what makes life worth living. Every second counts, no matter my condition. That's one way to look at it. Being completely free of pain and suffering. What matters most is engaging in relationships, you know, like being able to come and have dinner with a friend, or having people around you, whether that's a very high priority. Retaining autonomy, not being dependent on anybody. Retaining mentation over comfort. I had a scientist at community hospice in the inpatient unit who was an amazing climate scientist. And when we tried to give him more medication to take him out of comfort because he had a lot of non-verbal signs of pain, his wife said that he had made it really clear that he wants to tolerate more pain so he can retain his mentation and be lucid. So that was a value that he wrote in his advance directives. Sometimes people feel like life isn't worth living if I can't work and have something purposeful servitude. You know, they say that being generative and having service to others is a high quality form of life. And that's why a lot of seniors struggle, because they are unemployed, or, you know, no longer, they're retired, and their life may feel less meaningful. And that's why I think the village concept is so beautiful, because it gives people a sense of real purpose and value. So engaging in work and what's meaningful. Being able to live in my own home. Folks are like, if I have to leave my home, I'd rather not be alive. And I would say, as long as you can create an environment with a community and a village and close friends to stay at home, you have a lot more control about your end of life wishes. And of course, many of my adult children clients, I have adult children from all around the country who ask me to care for their parents. And the biggest thing is that the parents do not want to be a burden to their kids, financially, emotionally, practically, and physically. And so trying to navigate that world is really a big challenge. And I often say to the aging parent, can you just allow caregivers to come in for your kids, because they love you and they worry about you. And you are more of a burden to them by them worrying about your safety. So it's always this dance of independence and trying not to feel like a burden. But that's a value that we need to look at. Okay, next slide. Okay, so how do we prolong our life? How we keep folks alive despite a poor prognosis. And we all know, you know, we saw this during the COVID years. People were going on breathing machines. And, you know, we were talking a lot about advance directives during those first few COVID months, because people were pretty panicked about the images on TV. And so I said, you know, write your advance directives now. I mean, COVID put mortality right in our faces. And I said, write your advance directives and say, I never want to be on a ventilator. You can do that. You can say, you know, keep me at home with home oxygen, or take me to the hospital and external oxygen, but I don't ever put a ventilator in me. So ventilators keep us alive, and ICUs are full of them. And they serve a good purpose. You know, when there's a trauma, you want a breathing machine to get you through the trauma experience and then to get you back well. But there are too many people in our country living on breathing machines for years. So that's one way to keep our life going. Feeding tubes. All of us know people who have put a feeding tube in, and sometimes they're used for temporary problems, but other times it's hard to terminate a feeding tube if someone never retains the swallowing abilities. So feeding tubes stay in for many years, and then people have to decide whether to stop using a feeding tube. Dialysis is a way of filtering our blood when our kidneys fail, and many people are on dialysis. It's a every other day procedure, and at some point people can decide to stop their dialysis. Blood transfusions, advanced cancer patients have multiple transfusions. They become transfusion dependent for survival, and because we treat people to death, we will keep transfusing people to death. It's really gets to the place where you need to say, I recognize that my illness is causing me to be anemic, and I want to stop the transfusions. Also antibiotics, with people with dementia, because they can't swallow, they get respiratory infections from, ingesting bacteria into their lungs. So they get pneumonias, they get urinary tract infections, and you can tailor your advance directive saying, I'll take oral antibiotics, but I don't want to take IV antibiotics, because the IV antibiotics require I go to the hospital, and I don't want to go to the hospital if I get to some level of illness. So we use all these technologies to keep ourselves alive, and they're important to know about before we need them, or at least have the conversation, because we don't expect things to happen, and then they do. And then people who are accompanying us need to know what our values are around these choices. But surveys show that most clinicians do not often do the heroic measures that are offered to us. Okay, so treatments and technologies for end of life, palliative and compassionate extubation. So if someone is in the ICU and they look like they're not progressing to wellness, it's important for the clinicians and for those of us around to really start introducing the conversation of an extubation, a compassionate extubation. And sometimes people are extubated in ICU and they keep living. We're kind of shocked. And then they would either be transported home to die, or they could be transported to an inpatient unit. And the Washington Home Foundation has now supported the Washington Home Sibley inpatient unit, opened, I think, in August, or a couple months ago. And it's just, I went to visit, it's lovely. And so that could be a place where if somebody's in the ICU at Sibley and they were extubated, they could be, relocated to the inpatient unit at Sibley, which I'm just so thrilled that that's there. Palliative sedation is, something that can happen at home or in an inpatient unit where someone is, clearly signs are indicating that they're in pain or distress, and, morphine can be increased to make sure that they have a restful sleep. It's not, it's helping people to be comfortable, basically. Palliative radiation and palliative chemotherapy is used to shrink tumors and to create comfort. So patients need to know if the chemotherapy they're getting is palliative or if it's curative. And toward end of life, you can use radiation and chemo for those reasons, but you always have to weigh benefit and burden. Defibrillators, if people have a cardiac, if they have a cardiac mechanism to keep them alive, pacemakers, defibrillators, you can have a discussion about stopping those, because those are kind of things that do prolong our lives. V said stopping eating and drinking is something I'm very interested in. I participated in a video production of a client of mine who came. Her name is Rosemary Bowen, if you want to Google her name. And she was just this amazing woman who I met. Her daughter called. She had a spinal fracture. She was out to lunch with her friends, and she had a spinal fracture, ended up in the emergency room in great pain, and just said, I don't want to live like this. I don't want to deal with surgery. I just want to die. And she had always talked about wanting to end her life by fasting. And so she did it. and we recorded it, and it was just a beautiful 8 days of very little suffering. But we had this whole process, and there are groups. There's a group out of New York called New York End of Life. It's a .org, and they actually help teach people how to do end of life, stopping eating and drinking. But she did not have a terminal illness, but she did not want to live with debility, and so she stopped eating. Also, people can stop dialysis, and then ECMO is another technology people can stop, and then also medical aid in dying. As Susan talked about, I believe it's 10 states now. Maryland did not pass 2 years ago. It's going to be back in the legislation, hopefully, legislature this term. There's still some faith leaders in, I think, Prince George's County that are really struggling with it in Maryland. So they're doing a lot of lobbying, and even though there are states who have passed, they are constantly having to protect those laws because there's a force that wants to take those rights away. And in some states they get more liberal, the law, and other states it can be they can lose some rights related to their particular state's law. So I think it was in Oregon now, you don't have to have residency. So you can come into the state and you can access the law. So that's a big change. I had a patient who came from Arizona, and he had a very advanced cancer and HIV. And he caravanned across the country to DC with his 4 siblings. We found an Airbnb, and we accessed the law and the clinicians and the pharmacies, and we did it here in DC. And he only had to be here. He was just here for a month, and then he took the medical aid. Okay, so this is just looking at a linear, what are your values? Keep me alive at all costs, or keep me comfortable, allow me to die naturally, or keep me alive at all costs. So just really to have the conversation. And as Susan said, it's so important to have the conversation with your family, like where you are. And a lot of that depends on suffering, right? Like if you're not in a place of suffering, it's hard to think about this. But as people suffer, these values may change. I mean, my dad said his benchmark was if I can't drive. Well, that's ridiculous because there's a lot of people who can't drive, but it represented independence and living to him. And of course, he lived way beyond the part where he couldn't drive anymore, but that was like his benchmark at some place. So it's just, I always kept asking him, like, what makes life worth living to you? Physically and mentally. Okay, and then there's ways to communicate this. So no one can read your mind. And sometimes I say, do not pick your partner or somebody that you love to be your health proxy, because they sometimes want to keep you alive forever. But it's not about them, it's about what you want. You may have the best plans in mind, but unless you've communicated them and documented them, there's chaos and suffering. And even when we know folks do not want to be dependent on machines, the immediate response is to try something temporarily or short term, but it becomes very difficult to remove. And that's happened with my clients so much around feeding tubes and, intubation, and just trying, like, we'll just do this short term, but then you have to make really hard decisions later about stopping them. And I just want to share a short case story. I had a patient who was part of my aging solo group at Iona, a very high profile Washingtonian, just a brilliant woman. And she came to the aging solo sessions. We had 8-week session. And then I became her care manager. We talked a lot about what her particular desires were for end of life planning. And and then I said, it's important for me to meet your husband. And so I went to the home over the summer and met her husband, and we talked more about her advance directives. And then I didn't hear from her for a while. And it turned out that her cancer had progressed to brain cancer, and now she was no longer communicative. And so her husband wanted to continue treatment, and he never allowed me to help her put her on hospice. And it was a very difficult experience for me as a clinician, trying to defend what she had talked about over so many years. And so anyway, there are dilemmas like that that are just really painful. And I thought she did not have a very good death as she had planned to have. Anyway, find people to be your health proxy who really can honor what you wish. And just to say about the woman who did the fasting, the beautiful thing about the fasting that Rosemary chose is that her daughter supported her choice. She didn't want her mother to fast. She didn't have a terminal illness. She wanted her mother to live for another 20 years, even with maybe a fractured spine, but that would probably rehab and be fine, right? But she honored her mother's wishes. And so together we did this little production because we wanted to document how important it is to honor the person's wishes. So ways that we can communicate are advance directives, MOLS form, which is medical order of life-sustaining treatment, or PULSE, which is physician's order for life-sustaining treatment. And those are more simple forms with requires a doctor's signature. And then hospital DNRs, do not resuscitate in the hospital. There's advance directives there. Also in facilities, they have directives that people use, and people can have medical alert bracelets. I've always thought that I'd like to put DNR on my chest as a tattoo. But anyway, it's people, and then you have to update your advance directives. Like what you may feel when you're 50, you may not feel like when you're 70 or 80 or 90. So, and it's so important to choose a health proxy to go over these to make sure they're clear. And then other ways to communicate are these amazing, this is just a list of different things that I've used with clients, Prepare, and these are all the websites. The Conversation Project is a lot like what Susan was talking about, like introductory ways of having the conversation with people you love. A Go Wish card game is kind of a fun game that people play at death cafes or just gatherings. There's another group of people called Death Over Dinner. Deathcafe.org is there's thousands of them. If you go online, you'll show all the death cafes in DC this week. Like there's literally death cafes everywhere across the country. It started, I think, in the 70s in England, and it's a movement here where people just come together. It's not a support group, it's not a grief group, it's not a lecture. It's just coming together and talk about anything that comes to mind. And every group is different. Like one time I did a group where there was a lot of people under 35, and so they were talking about their friends wanting to commit suicide, and that's a very different group than being with seniors. So anyway, Death Over Dinner, 5 Wishes. Many of you have seen that document, the 5 Wishes document. And then advance directives, you can get them online or talk to an attorney. mydirectives.com. This is just National Healthcare Decisions Day, is a whole bunch of resources put out by the government. Vital Talk, and Vital Talk was started by a really amazing doctor. She has a book called it's called Extreme Measures, and I highly recommend that book, Extreme Measures. Written by a physician who was an ICU physician, and now she's a director of palliative care. And so you learn about her whole kind of like conversion experience as a physician. And then also getpalliativecare.org is another option. Compassion and Choices. This is an amazing manual that they've put together. It's about 20 pages of just very clear, like a values worksheet, and dementia directives, like very clear about if you get dementia, how would you feel about different treatment modalities. It's free. It's a great tool book. I give it to all my clients, and it's a great talking tool. Okay, so inside every woman or man is a young woman wondering what the hell happened. And that is so true, right? Like life is short. And it's just the more we can keep our mortality in front of us, the more I think we can really enjoy life. And this is a final picture. I raised guide dogs. It was something that I started doing like 5 years ago. And this little guy on the right is my fourth. And my others are serving blind people across the country now. And it's just a joy. And this other is my pet lab. And so he helps raise the guide dogs. And I'm just so aware of the need for partnership and community and not being alone, and feeling a sense that we're kind of on a journey together. We have common mortality in many ways, and that there's a lot of power in community. And I think that's what underscores the village movement, is that death is very terrifying. And even more than that, suffering, dying is terrifying. And so the more we can share and embrace our fears together, I think it reduces it. So.
So it's time to go on to questions, and there may be a little bit of time at the end. The questions will go till 11:25, and then we'll go into a breakout group. You and Susan fit together so well that you picked up on a lot of the themes that she started and then elaborated on them in more detail. So for me, it was very valuable. Thanks so much. And now I want to see if there are, Judy Berman has a question.
Actually, just a comment. I was one of the folks that I follow for to learn about COVID and things like that, posted something recently. It said, years ago, I was telling my oldest friend how we discuss end-of-life preferences with patients. You can make it much easier, he said. Sit me in a recliner, put the Final Four on TV, give me a beer, and ask me if I'm having fun. If I say no, pull the plug.
That's great. So who else has a comment or something? Let me look in the chat. Marilyn Goldberg has 2 books to recommend. What I wish people knew about dementia and compassionate dying. And here's Don and Barb Heffernan have another question. Go ahead, Don, unmute yourself.
Thank you. There we go. Dixcy, when you talked about confirming with your doctor that you're on the same page, that resonated with Barb and me. And we've got physicals coming up, and we'll talk to our GP. But then we've also talked recently about possibly even getting a concierge doctor, because we want more centralized control. Do you know of any resources that identify doctors that are on the same page as you are? How do you find them?
Yeah, that is really, really tricky. I mean, a lot of the concierge doctors, a lot of people are moving toward that, unfortunately, because Medicare is not reimbursing physician visits in the way that people need, and they want access to their doctor. And so we really do have a 2-tiered system in many ways. But yeah, it's just, I mean, I can give you some referrals of concierge doctors I've worked with, but like I said, one I just love, but I know he's not going to respect this patient's wishes.
Well, we don't want that.
But he's a great doctor. But I think, it's we are consumers, and consumers drive the market. And so we need to tell our doctors what we want. We need to teach our doctors, even if they're doctors for many years, we need to teach them about helping us die. And it's sad, but it really is. It has to be patient driven.
Thank you.
I had a patient at Ingleside that was a hospice patient, and they had been married close to 78 years. This couple, 78 years they were married. They were in their late 90s, and he was under hospice, and she was perfectly healthy. And she said to me, "I want to get under hospice." I'm like, "Well, you don't qualify." And I said, but there are ways to help yourself qualify, possibly if you stopped eating. She's like, oh, I'm going to do that. And I said, well, there is, I told her, I said, you guys can both start reducing your intake. They were both competent. Their kids were totally on board with it. They did not want to be apart. And so she started reducing her intake, and she got weaker, and he died one day and she died 2 days later. And it was like so informative that it was guided by what her wishes were. Right. And they did have a psychiatric evaluation. Someone came in and evaluated whether she was acting crazy. I didn't think it was crazy. I mean, she was close to 100 years old, and their beloved life partner was dying. She wanted to die with him. And so she did what she could, and she was successful.
Great. So I have another question from Carolyn Kulishek. Did I pronounce it right? And please unmute yourself.
Thank you. And yes, it's Kulishek. Could you tell me again how to order the free copy of Compassion and Choices document?
Yeah, you can go on either compassionandchoices.org, or you can email Wendy Minor. It's W Minor, MINOR, at compassionandchoices.org. And she'll send you this free booklet. And it's just great. It looks like this. And you get electronic copy or hard copy.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And the next one, I saw Peter Steins. Hi, Peter. It's nice to see your face.
Hi, Mary. A terrific presentation. Boxy really enjoyed it. But specifically, I was trying to work the document 5 wishes. And there were, on the one hand, how do I feel about things now? And then how am I likely to feel when down the road I really have to take action or no action? And on the one hand, one is supposed to make a decision or preference subject to change in the future, which we only partly understand. And so, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, it's just, you know what you want, and how much suffering you want to endure. I mean, aging is about suffering, really, right? Like, we are about breaking down and losing our abilities and lots of loss, and it's hard. And so the more you can verbalize what are the benchmarks that make life worth living to me, and how you can explain, I don't want to spend months in a hospital. We use most of our Medicare dollars the last 6 months of our life, and a lot in the last month of our life. And it's just the wrong use of Medicare dollars, I think, because there's so much more we could do with healthcare funding. And we just throw medicine at people who are so fragile and so close to end of life. And so if you don't want that, if you don't want to go back to the emergency room, I had a man last night who was very weak, probably got the flu, but he was very, very sick. And I called the family, and I'm like, I know your dad does not want to go to the emergency room, and we need to keep him home. It's not worth it. And so, it's just really having people in your life who can represent you, even when you're in a weak space.
Well, going to emergency in Washington, D.C. is a little bit like going to an all-night dentist. It's horrible. But I still think if one is reflective about one's life, that things change. Mm-hmm. I have an oncologist who I know wants to keep me alive, but I'm not yet ready for a conversation with him about end of life. So to me, end of life is down the road, but I don't know when it's going to come. And should one be reflecting about these things ahead of time? Sure. But when? Yeah.
Please, please, please start talking to your doctor now about that, because you don't want to make these decisions when you're in the emergency room or when you've been admitted to the hospital. And we all know that hospitals are acute care settings that will patch us up and put us Humpty Dumpty back together. And then you go to rehab, and then you go home, and then you start back over again. And that happens many times before we actually say enough is enough. So have the conversation now. And I bet your doctor will welcome it, because it's hard for them to bring it up. But if you bring it up, they will welcome the conversation.
Thank you.
Peter, do you have more questions? Oh. So is there any more, are there many more people? I don't see any questions particularly in the chat.
Should I ask how-
There's one question about,
Sure.
did we discuss death doulas? And I know that's on the list for Liz Gregg to talk about. She is actually a certified, whatever one can be, death doula. And you might say a few words if you have some, Dixcy.
Yeah,
We have about another
I know-
5 minutes.
I know some death doulas, and I think it's a great service modality. It's like having a doula for midwifery, for birthing. And, death is another form of birthing, I believe. Like there's a great quote that says something about like, it's not the end, but it's the infinite expanding of life in a different way, like taking down the walls of this life. And I feel like those who have passed on infuse our lives all the time. And so to help people get transition out of this life to another experience is very profound. And I think death doulas serve a great purpose, not only for the person who's suffering, but also for families who are grieving. So a big shout out to death doulas.
I have a comment, but I don't know how to
Okay,
tell you.
I'll come here. Wait. My husband has a comment, and why don't you come? Let me go get him.
Mary, in the meantime, while Mary's getting that, I have a question, Dixcy. I had heard that calling 911 and having the EMTs come is a bad idea.
Well,
Can you speak to that?
you can actually ask EMTs to just put you back to bed and say, do not transport. So on the MOLS form that you should put on your wall at the doorway, you can say, do not transport. And that will keep you from going to the hospital. And a lot of times people fall, and EMTs are great about helping people get back to bed.
Yeah.
But, a fall can be minor, or a fall can be life-changing. You can end up in an ICU with a brain hemorrhage.
We can play this over for her if she wants.
I'm not Mary Proctor, like it says. I am Mary Proctor's husband. And I wanted to make one suggestion, which helps me a lot. Every Sunday, I read the 2 pages of fine print obituaries in the New York Times that are put in by the friends and relations of the people who died. And it is a wonderful opportunity to see all kinds of wonderful lives that people led. And it becomes something to look forward to see my own in.
We had at the End of Life Expo, we had a obit writing seminar as part of our presentations. It was so fun. And then we did another one with the same person virtually after the seminar. And so she brought all these examples of obituaries that she collected. And one of them was Duke died. That was it. But it is interesting, like when you do a obit writing seminar about what you would write down, and like families love if somebody has written their own obituary, and to write down like what has made life worth meaning for you. Like I had a close friend who was Secret Service for the White House for Ronald Reagan, and he wrote down something I totally wouldn't have thought he would have written down for his obituary. Like it was just amazing, the things that he did as an avocation more than his vocation.
That's a great comment. And Bill doesn't read me all the obituaries because I'm busy reading the art section and the book review, but he reads me particularly the funny ones and the ones where the writers have captured something special about the person. And he doesn't read me the resume ones. So Judy, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I have a question about the difference between sort of, or distinguishing between somebody who is depressed because of the limitations, dealing with incontinence and just other things, these sort of indignities, I think that, that can accompany certain illnesses and things like that, versus a kind of rational or, because depression changes how you think, right? Depression leads people to suicide who really have much to live for, right? Is there anything you can say about kind of distinguishing that, or does it matter? Maybe it doesn't. At end of life, I'm not,
I think there's a lot of emotional suffering that people who have terminal illnesses experience, that it's hard for me to make a judgment about whether they want to live or not and why. And like the gentleman who came across the country with his family, he was like 50-year-old guy, and he was so loved by his siblings. But there is a waiting period, so he had one doctor visit, and then there's a waiting period before his other physician, and that's how the law is written in DC. And in some states, they're reducing the waiting period because people want to move on and get the prescription. But they're usually like a 2-week to a month-long waiting period. And, people are depressed. Chronic painful illness is depressing. But I didn't think of him as necessarily as suicidal, but he saw it as an extension of his treatment, that he wanted to take this medication to alleviate his extreme suffering. And like Susan said, a lot of people get the prescription and never take it. But I think people contemplate it a long time. And they also sometimes will even use their hospice meds, more generously and put themselves in a palliative sedation. Or I had a gentleman who was in his 60s with COPD, and he was not under hospice at the time. And he took an overdose of morphine, but he wasn't complete, and he ended up in the ICU. And it was after that experience that he then became eligible for hospice, and then he took the medical aid in dying. But you do have to be hospice eligible to get medical aid. So I don't know. It's hard for me to know like how to put a value on people's emotional suffering. But I think definitely it's there.
So Dixcy, time has come for our breakout groups, and it's really been a kind of pleasure, because it allows me anyway to look ahead. And I have observed in my own family some good deaths. So I have some models. But really, you and Susan have put all the pieces together, or a lot of pieces together, so that we can manage dealing with our doctors, dealing with the hospitals, dealing with EMT, et cetera. So I really appreciate it. It's great. Thank you so much.
I think what you said is really, in terms of introducing the conversation, is you can talk about those good deaths or bad deaths as third party. Like, what was it about Aunt Susan's death that was terrifying to you? Or what did you see about that death that was like peaceful to you? And you can talk about it in a third party. And I think that's a way that we can really have real heart-to-heart conversations.
That's a very good point. And we can maybe carry it over even a little bit into the breakout group. So we're going to go ahead.
There was one final question about what makes somebody hospice eligible.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see that. Yeah. Go ahead.
According to the Medicare guidelines, every disease has a category. So with dementia, no eating, no drinking, no walking, really a very low bar. The bar is pretty hard to get in under dementia, because then once people start eating and drinking, possibly, then they could be living a long time under hospice. And hospice really wants you to be terminal, right? It's a Medicare benefit, and they don't want you to live forever. Although I have a patient who's been on hospice for 2.5 years. So he keeps requalifying because he keeps progressing downward. But if people plateau and get better, they have to get off hospice. And people do live longer under hospice care. So there's a good chance that if you get on earlier, you do have an extended prognosis. And anyway, each disease is different. So kidney failure, you look at blood values that would qualify you based on certain values, cardiac disease, liver disease, but there's benchmarks for every category. And that's what really determines whether you're eligible.
So thank you so much. And we will hear more from Liz Gregg. And it's good to hear multiple takes on these subjects. So Mary Bloodworth, are you getting ready to put us all into breakout groups?